project is really trying to explore what it means to change policy at a radical level, at real speed, to try and respond to the scale of change which is needed to reduce emissions to avoid the most dangerous consequences of climate change. The recent report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change made it very clear that we didn't just need incremental change, we needed radical change at a scale which was consistent with the science. Historically, we've been able to reduce emissions inside Europe 1-2% a year at best. But when we look at the scale of the challenge, we really need to be reducing emissions 7-9% a year to try and have a decent probability of avoiding the worst consequences of climate change. Many of the policies that we have in place at the moment are really fixed into a culture of delivering an incremental change. A good example of that would be the EU emissions trading scheme, which is fixed to just under 2% reduction each year in emissions. Not all emissions are included under that scheme, but about 50% of Europe's territorial emissions are. What we find, though, is that we get fixed within these cultures of what's acceptable and unacceptable. And what we want to do in this project is step beyond trying to think about how can we improve the emissions trading scheme, how could we improve efficiency standards, to be thinking of what would it mean to introduce a policy which led to a sizable reduction, and how do we introduce a policy which on paper doesn't seem palatable for potentially economic reasons, for social concerns, and how do we get such an issue onto the table? One of the policy areas we consider, or we are going to look at, relates to consumption-based emissions. While Europe's emissions have dropped within the territory of Europe, our emissions have increased when we take a consumption-based approach. And this is because we are importing more products than we export, and those products required emissions all the way through the supply chain to produce. So therefore, we would be looking at how we could introduce a consumption-based approach into European and UK climate policy. What would that mean, and how do we overcome the barrier to implement something which is on paper perceived to be radical, but we believe in the long term is consistent with the climate science and also offers us a new collection maybe of policy interventions to help us overcome the barriers and help us achieve radical, quick and important change that without we really face some very serious concerns. So in a way, the project really tries to go beyond what we might perceive as normal to understand how we implement something different and radical.